So first of all, I cannot agree more with Mr. Darrag's first comment on the fact that when we discuss security, we do not have the issue of human rights front and center. And I think a very good illustration of Mr. Darrag's comment is the discrepancy between the attendance of this room in the human rights session and the attendance in the room next door, which talks about much more exciting political types of topics than human rights. So, point very well taken, and I suppose human nature overtakes. I suppose it's befitting for a Syrian to actually talk about questions of human rights and the new architecture of the regional, the security of the region, considering Syria being a perfect test case of the complete collapse of regional order and perhaps an international security order. Syria being basically the largest humanitarian disaster since World War II, with millions of refugees and internally displaced persons, with a failing state, with countless atrocities that have been committed as we speak, actually, as we sit here today. But allow me to sort of introduce a new element, or perhaps an element that was missing from the discussion or from the questions that were posed by the organizers, and that is the question of the rule of law. So every time we talk about, and perhaps this is the lawyer in me, but every time we talk about human rights, that needs to be always coupled with the question of the rule of law within the international context. The rule of law is the notion that gives order to societies, that gives order to any international or regional order. The rule of law is the notion that regulates the internal affairs of any particular country or any particular society, as it should also, or as it aspires or potentially regulates also the affairs of the international community as we live in it. And I think once we are aware of the fact that rule of law is a fundamental issue coming from a purely pragmatic approach. I mean, you talked about morality and ethics and the collapse of that, and how those constructs usually are hijacked by political powers to basically realize particular goals and hegemony and domination, etc. But I'm not going to even go there. I'm talking about human rights and the rule of law as a pragmatic notion of keeping order, keeping security, as Mr. Darrag was talking about. And so, just to put things in a quick context, I find myself forced to actually go through some of the horrendous criminality that has been practiced in Syria over the past 6 years, up until this moment in time, to illustrate the fact that with this immense criminality, we're still not talking about any questions of accountability. Impunity still runs rampant in the region and in the world as we specifically address Syria, which is very highly enigmatic to someone like me. So a very recent report that was issued on the situation in Syria by a human rights organization, Syrian Network on Human Rights, issued actually a very conservative estimate in terms of the number of casualties that have been produced by the past 6 years of the conflict in Syria. And they estimated about 200,000, just a little over 200,000 civilians killed. I'm talking about civilians here. Now, other estimates go up to 500,000, but this is an organization that usually is, accused of being a bit of a biased organization towards the opposition, and as such, it presenting such conservative numbers to me from an organization like that suggests that the numbers are actually a lot higher than that. It's very important to point out that over 90% of these casualties, of these 200,000, according to this organization, according to this report and according to many other reports actually, very credible, over 90% of the casualties have been produced by the Assad regime, abetted and aided by Iranian militias and militias that are loyal to Iran. There are 40-something, militias that have been brought into Syria that aid and abet the criminality of the Syrian regime. So over 90% of that criminality, there's no doubt who is responsible for it. Just to also put things in perspective, since we're talking about security and we're talking about counterterrorism, that has been a theme in terms of what international powers are paying attention to mostly. Out of these casualties, that huge number of casualties, only 2% is the responsibility of an organization like ISIS. As horrible and as anti-civilizational ISIS is, it is responsible for only 2% of the 200,000 casualties, civilian casualties in Syria. Over 90% are committed by Syria, by the Syrian regime, and by Iran, by Iranian militias, by a state that has a seat at the table when it comes to international organizations. Yet nobody's talking about that. Everybody's talking about ISIS, everybody's talking about Al-Qaeda, etc. Let me remind everyone about the chemical attacks that took the lives of over 1,500 people within the matter of half an hour in August 2013. The UN OPCW, which is established a joint task force and joint investigative mechanism to basically find out who committed the chemical attack, and has issued a number of reports that implicate the Syrian regime in that. Again, aided and abetted by the Iranian help through the support of the Syrian Air Force. There are, over 10 starvation sieges of metropolitan areas right now by the Syrian regime in Syria. As we speak right now, people are actually dying of hunger because of starvation sieges conducted by the Syrian regime. There are forced demographic shifts. The latest was a few days ago in Homs. I'm not sure if you heard of it, but where you have areas, pockets of resistance, basically completely relocated into other parts of Syria, and in preparation for bringing loyal population to the regime to populate these areas. Torture and detention. I mean, the UN Commissioner of Human Rights just a few days ago called Syria a big torture chamber with tens of thousands of detainees, as we speak, being tortured to death. Many of them are being tortured to death. Many of them are starving to death. Airstrikes targeting civilians, and the list go on and on and on. And so, not to take much more of the time allocated to me, and I'd like to maybe address more in the question-answer session, have a discussion. But after all of this, there are serious talks right now by certain international powers about the rehabilitation of Bashar al-Assad. In the previous session that took place in this room, there have been talks about the need to deal with the Syrian regime in order to achieve some semblance of security and some semblance of peace in Syria. To me, that's absurd. That's absurd not as a Syrian, but as someone who looks at the international security order and the regional security order and sees very well that these types of violations make security completely non-sustainable. And obviously, without taking much of a tangent, there is always a misconception on what those who oppose Bashar al-Assad seek in terms of a final outcome in Syria, and that's something that I'd be more happy to address. It's a much more complex situation than the binary between Bashar al-Assad and extremists. It's much more nuanced, and that's a picture I'm happy to contribute to later. Can I just address really quickly one of the questions that you have in 30 seconds? I mean, you talk about mechanisms, or you talk about human rights, how can we integrate the concept of human rights in the new regional security architecture? And my question would be, was it ever integrated in any security architecture, whether international or regional? And in order for us, and not to just present problems and to contribute in the presentation of some solutions, what I submit to everybody here, and as a lawyer, I would say that the most important element of any new security architecture, whether in the region or internationally, is the question of enforcement of international human rights law and the rule of law within the international context. I'll stop here. Thank you very much for listening to me.